All right, before we get going, I do want to mention that part 2 of chapter 9 is on the table. I also emailed it out for Revelation chapter 9, the second half of chapter 9. We may or may not be able to start that today, I'm not sure. But then also chapter 3 of the Messianic prophecies for Wednesday night, that's this coming Wednesday night. Chapter 3 is available on this back table. I mentioned this last Wednesday night that I would do kind of like an outline with some questions, since our workbook doesn't really have any questions in it, and so I included those on the outline as well. And then Wednesday night I'll have chapter 4 for the week ahead. I think I've got everything. Okay, so last week we started chapter 9 and we noticed that the fifth trumpet sounds. We've been seeing how that the seven seals have been opened, going all the way back to chapter 6 and 7, starting really chapter 5 and then into 6 and 7. And then with the seventh seal being opened, you had the beginning of these trumpets sounding. And these trumpets represented God's judgment on those who are doing evil. Certainly the Roman Empire is under consideration in the context. But as each trumpet sounds, it's getting progressively worse. Remember earlier we looked at how that a third of the grass and trees, and a third of this and a third of that, and that's going to continue here in chapter 9. And it focuses on there's consequences for the actions and the conduct of people that are doing these wicked things and troubling the people of God. But specifically as God's judgment is going to come upon the Roman Empire, it's going to get worse and worse. But the goal of it certainly is not to just, there's a sense of vengeance being played out, as God promised his people there would be. But there's also a sense in which there's warning. In fact, these trumpets, throughout the Old Testament, the blowing of trumpets represented a concept of warning. It represented a concept of something imminent that was coming. And this was meant as a warning sign. And at the end of chapter 9, we're going to see how that it seems as though the goal of these trumpets was to get people to turn away from the things that they were doing, to get them to change how they were living. And ultimately that would affect as well how they were treating Christians. And they didn't. They wouldn't repent. They wouldn't turn away. But as we noticed last week, the bottomless pit and how the star that had fallen from heaven was given the key to the bottomless pit, and we talked about this being most likely the representation of being Satan, and how this bottomless pit is being opened. And the bottomless pit would seem to indicate kind of the depths of depravity, and how that God has always allowed Satan to, in fact, throughout the New Testament, he's referred to as the prince of the earth or prince of the power of the air. But it's reference to that, even though he has reign in the sense of being able to tempt people, there is a limit to how far he's able to go and how much he's able to do. And whether it still works the way that it did in the days of Job, where Satan specifically would come and request, or even perhaps even as Jesus would refer to Peter, how that Satan has requested you that he may sift you as wheat. And whether that still happens the same way as it did then, I don't know. But the fact that we do have this recognition of this bottomless pit, the smoke that ascends from it kind of represents this darkened state, this darkness of wickedness and the depths of depravity being shown. And then out of the pit, verse 3 and 4, we see these locusts/scorpions. They're locusts in the sense of what's being described here, but the way that their body is shaped, they have tails like scorpions. And verse 4, contrary to what literal locusts do, these are commanded not to hurt any of the grass or any green thing, but rather to hurt those who are wicked, those who don't have the seal of God on their foreheads. Remember, we talked about those who have the seal of God on their foreheads, the 144,000. That number is not literal. It's representative of all the faithful on earth at any given time. Certainly during John's time, it would have been during John's time. However many people that would represent, whether it's more or less, is irrelevant. That represents kind of that fullness of God's faithful people on earth. And they are the ones who, quote unquote, have the seal of God on their foreheads. Not literally, but the sense in which that God knows those who are his. And then in verse 5, they're not to kill, and again, this describes not literal beings per se, but it's describing the immorality of the Roman Empire, especially as it went on, and there was less attention paid to, I guess you could say, things that had proper value, and more attention was paid to entertainment, more attention was paid to self-gratification, and sinful elements of character. And so in verse 6, we see how that in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. And the way that these scorpions are or scorpion-locusts are presented, you see on the kind of an outward aspect, all kinds of different elements that on their surface would seem to be attractive. And that's exactly how temptation works. The way Satan presents temptation, he's never going to present it in a way that is outright abhorrent per se to you or to I. That he's going to do it in a way that's subtle, in a way that he's going to try to sneak through our armor and our awareness, to try to sneak that temptation and ultimately sneak sin into our lives. Well, the way in which the Roman society viewed things, when you start looking at the shapes of these locusts, they were like horses prepared unto battle. I mean, they had great confidence in their military, great confidence in their technology. On their heads were crowns of gold, not actual crowns of gold, but something that is not genuine. It seems like they have crowns of gold, which would represent victory. It would represent the concept of overcoming the enemies of their enemies and so forth. But these weren't real crowns of gold. And their faces were as the faces of men. This term men isn't literally males, it's people. And it carries with it that sense of something that you can relate to. And that's how Satan delivers temptation. He delivers it in a way that it's going to be something I can relate to, something that appeals to me. And James describes that course of temptation, how that each man is drawn away and enticed. He kind of describes the steps that temptation takes. And it's interesting, he doesn't mention Satan in there, because ultimately, whose fault is it if I choose to sin and fall to temptation? It's my own fault. I can't blame Satan. Well, it's Satan's fault. No, it's my fault, because each man is enticed by his own desires. Now, Satan, does he stir that pot? Does he try to draw us out? Yes, he does. But that doesn't change the fact that it's my responsibility to maintain the thoughts and the mind that I'm supposed to have. But as we're seeing here in verse 7, these things, even though we know, and John's being described to John what these things are, from your ordinary Roman citizen, this is something, they're not seeing the whole form. They're seeing things that appeal to them. And that's the way sin works. That's the way temptation works. Verse 8, they had hair as the hair of women. Their teeth were as the teeth of lions. Again, the full imagery isn't what is being represented. It's each one individually. The hair of women having this beauty, this appeal. The teeth of lions, something that is sharp, that can devour. That's something that is appealing from especially if you're a Roman citizen or member of the Roman Empire, and you're considering your place in the world, and how that for all intents and purposes the Roman Empire was the world. And there was great, I would say even overconfidence and a arrogance about that state for a long time, and that led to this, started leading to some of this degradation. But back in verse 6, this kind of helps us to understand, and we mentioned the fact that we see this play out a little bit even in our own society, and how that we have so many, especially young people, seeking causes, seeking things to stand for, which ordinarily you would think, well, that's a great thing. But when those causes, or their desire for searching for meaning and for fulfillment, when it's directionless, they end up championing things that they don't really understand. They don't really know what it's about. They aren't able to really define it. And that's we're seeing a lot of that playing out on college campuses right now. And in a broad sense, when a society becomes directionless, when it becomes valueless, you end up having that vacuum. And what does nature abhor? Nature abhors a vacuum. And it's going to be filled with something. And if it's not going to be filled with, and not necessarily even just things of God per se, but of some sort of a standard, some sort of a morality or value system, it's going to be filled with the depths of depravity. And that's exactly how it played out for the Roman Empire. And this is what's being described here. And so Satan is being allowed all of this is being done. Now again, part of the purpose of this were for some people to be able to take notice and say, this is what a terrible state we're in. We need to start turning our path around here. And yet, that wasn't the response that people had. Instead, they just kind of gave themselves over to it. And ultimately, verse 6, I don't think what's being described is necessarily a conscious desire to seek death and shall not find it, but more so a sense of there's no meaning in my life. And I think you see that play out in people who have no faith in God, who don't have those values. In a lot of ways, ultimately, even Solomon in Ecclesiastes, he describes how that he went down that path. He tried to, anything his eyes saw, he sought to have it. He tried everything under the sun. And in the end, what was it? Vanity. Grasping after the wind. Okay. And it was something, though, that he knew that there was no fulfillment there. And yet people still try. And in an effort to, I guess maybe try to justify their actions, they'll say there is no God. Or they'll assume that God isn't really going to send anyone to torment. And so they'll kind of excuse it that way. But in the end, people want to do the things they want, but they'll never find fulfillment or contentment in those things. And then they're confused. This is one of the reasons why people are constantly seeking things or they're constantly seeking experiences, because they think it'll fulfill them or satisfy them in some way, and it doesn't. It doesn't give them peace. It doesn't give them rest. And I think in a lot of ways that's what you're finding in verse 6, is that when people are in that depth of depravity, when they kind of give themselves over to the world, there is a sense in which deep down there is a seeking and a searching, and they cannot find. They want rest, they want peace, they want some relief of this burden that they know that they have deep down. There's a part of them that knows that, and yet they can't find what they're looking for. And in a lot of ways, I think you see people who hate their lives, they hate what they are, but they don't really know where to go, and they don't want to turn to the Bible, that's for sure. They don't want to turn to God, because that suggests that I'm having to submit to something that some God tells me to do. They don't want to do that. And yet, it's kind of like they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have that release, that contentment, that rest, that peace, but they're not willing to do the things that actually lead to true fulfillment and peace and rest in the soul. And that's something that a lot of people aren't willing to do. Go ahead, Snoop.
Well, I mean, kind of an example would be abortion. There's, and I'm not trying to open a can of worms, but just draw some canvas, I guess. You hear stories about women who choose to have an abortion, right? They might have regretted what they did to get pregnant. But then after the abortion, they feel even worse.
Yeah.
Because they know that what they did was wrong.
Yeah.
So they have a kind of like the scorpion sting or the wasp sting. They've got this with them all the time.
Yeah.
Because society said, "Oh, it's okay to do this."
Yeah.
And it's so, society is so easy to, when when you think about it, getting pregnant before you were married back in the 50s, you got shipped off somewhere. Your family, it was shameful.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have high schools that have classes for girls that, I'm not saying that's not wrong to support them. I don't have a problem supporting those young women that have children out of wedlock. But you just look at what the difference between what society expected, 30 years ago,
Yeah.
and what society expected now.
Yeah.
Expects now.
Well, and examples like that are, you don't hear much about them, because a lot of those examples are suppressed, because a lot of people don't want people knowing that that's kind of what the end result is, that sometimes you feel terrible about it. We see that playing out with transgenderism as well. a lot of people end up having terrible regrets for the rest of their lives because of things that they did. And a lot of these stories of individuals who underwent life-altering surgeries at a young age, and now for the rest of their life they're having to deal with that, and they regret it. And of course, anytime you deal with things that are sinful or things that don't have, that aren't associated with the values that God wants us to have, there's going to be consequences. Whether those are lifelong consequences or not, there's always going to be consequences. There's always going to be a toll to pay, I guess you could say, from that perspective. A lot of times physical, certainly spiritual.
Well, and that's what, the verses from 8 and above where it's talking about, it looks like something with something, it looks acceptable to
Yeah.
us. It looks okay, we like it, but that's innocent. Like I can social drink, and then that leads to something else. It may look appealing, and when you give into it, you have a wasp sting.
Yeah.
Anybody that's ever been stung by a wasp, that little bitty sting can make you stop in your tracks.
Yeah.
Because it hurts so bad.
Yeah. Yeah. Going on to verse 9, says they had breastplates as it were breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. Again, these creatures are not little, they're not real creatures. It's representative of these characteristics of sin and of immorality that appealed to the Roman Empire, or people of the Roman Empire, and they were willing to give themselves over to it because this is what their empire was about. Ultimately, this is what it had become. It had become seeking the most indulgent of satisfaction through physical things, and that's exactly what ultimately they kind of gave themselves over to it. And while it was supposed to be a warning, you need to turn away from these things, look at what's happening to your society, they didn't heed it. Yeah.
I don't know if everybody has a Harry Potter reference, but it's kind of like a Bogart, but instead of what you're afraid of,
It's what you want.
it's what you want.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's kind of like that mirror.
That mirror, yeah.
Harry Potter, where it's what you want, but you're wasting your life.
It's trying to seek it and that sort of thing. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think these represent everything that when people of the Roman Empire, when they looked at themselves and at what their desires were, this is what it represented. And yet behind it all, notice what isn't mentioned in terms of the things that are beautiful and wonderful is that sting. And certainly you talk about the sting of death, the sting of sin, and the danger that it provides, not just in the flesh. I mean, obviously there's physical danger associated with sin, but the spiritual aspect of it, that ultimately when people are so given over to those things, they don't want to hear anything about how to get out of it in a lot of ways. And there are going to be some who they're going to come to themselves, they're going to realize, I need to do something. I don't know what, but I need to do something. And that's where the gospel call then can ring forward into a heart that's willing to hear. But for a lot of them, they choose deliberately to try to find their fulfillment in the world.
It almost brings us 360 back to the Garden of Eve and the serpent in the tree.
Yeah, it does, yeah. Yeah, in all the ways that John describes in 1 John chapter 2 about the pride of life and the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life, all those things that appealed to Eve regarding the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, certainly all is contained within what the world provides in terms of the sinful aspects. And of course, what does John say is happening to those things? They're passing away. They're not going to last. They don't last.
She got a pretty nasty skin.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so verse 10, we see they had tails like unto scorpions. There were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men for 5 months. And of course, this term 5 months isn't a literal 5 months. It's a sense of an incomplete amount of time, not incomplete by accident, but by nature. In that there was a set time that God allowed this to take place. But it was meant for a warning. That's what it was meant to be. And that hurt men for 5 months. It kind of represents that sense in which this is a limited amount of time, okay, that God has set forth for this to take place. Then in verse 11, we have this king that is over them. They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. Y'all know what Abaddon or Apollyon means? Both terms? The destroyer. Yeah, the destroyer. And of course, again, just as we were talking about in verse 1, the association with Satan or the devil, verse 11, I believe, is still this representation of Satan. Again, it's worth noting that Linsky in his commentary, he suggests that none of this is about Satan, this is all about God's judgment. But given the nature of what we're describing here, that we're describing the concept of sin, we're describing the concept of depravity and so forth, you can't really explain it any other way. And then if you stick to that and still say we're not talking about Satan, that means that God is sending forth depravity. God is sending forth the sin and temptation. And I don't believe that's the case at all. And so I do think what we're talking about in verse 11 is the destroyer, and of course the term Satan, devil, one who opposes, one who is the adversary, and it certainly fits the destroyer. Not literal destroyer, but the destroyer of what? Souls. And not literally like destroy them, but it can wreaks havoc on the soul. That's what Satan, he is the one who brings forth this temptation, and the soul, when given over to it, is just destroyed beyond measure, especially in how it then relates to the relationship with God, but also in its relationship with other people and how sin can cause terrible things in the flesh with other people as well. All right, so anything through verse 11 then? Okay. It is notable that what is sin but the destruction of the soul and spirit, and who is the master of sin but Satan? And I think that was a really important point. One of the commentaries mentioned that, and I included that in our notes on the kind of the locust scorpion king thing. All right, let's cover our questions. Question 1, what does the first woe represent? Remember, we've got these 3 woes that are being contained, and this first woe is contained here with this, with the sixth trumpet, or the fifth trumpet being blown here. What does this first woe represent? Kind of the first half of chapter 9.
That's the wicked and sinful.
Yeah, the wickedness, huh? Yeah, and you know, we're applying this to the Roman Empire because that's the generation in which John is receiving this. Certainly, I think there's even a broader sense in which it could apply to any generation. But specifically, as we talk about the Roman Empire and the things that led to its ultimate destruction, you had natural calamities that affected it. You had internal corruption of values and so forth that led to kind of an internal downfall. But then you had external results of people, of wars, of invaders, and things like that. And the 3 put together is what ended up bringing down the Roman Empire. And so you have this first woe being described and showing kind of the downfall of this internal state of the mind and of the heart, the kind of the depths of depravity here. Question 2, what does the smoke that arose from the bottomless pit seem to represent? Yeah, the darkness of mind, the darkness, you know, wherever there isn't light, it's dark, right? Darkness is the absence of light. And throughout the writings of John, who is the giver of light? God is. And where there is no God in the heart of a person, what is there? It's just darkness. Okay? And throughout the New Testament, there's references to minds being darkened. It's a sense not just of literal sense of not having knowledge or something like that, but of a sense of forgetting God or not knowing God, a sense in which in a person's life, because of the absence of the values that God gives us, that then has an immediate effect not just on the soul, but then on the flesh as well. And that kind of that darkness that is represented from this bottomless pit, again, and it fits that imagery of this kind of the depths of sin. You have this smoke coming out of this pit, and then from the smoke come these creatures. Well, the only way that sin is going to overtake somebody like that is if they become darkened. as if their minds and their hearts don't care about God anymore. And that's how that works. That's how that happens. And that's where people can be so easily lured by the trickery and the snares of Satan. And that's part of what these creatures represent, is that lure of temptation. All right, anything through question 1 or 2? Question 3, who were the locust scorpions allowed to harm? Those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Okay, these are human beings who didn't have the seal of God on their foreheads. So within the context, why would those who did have the seal of God on their foreheads not be harmed? Why would they be exempt from it? Because they're faithful, because they're focused on serving God, they're focused on doing what's right, which means that they can see through the darkness. Okay, the smoke doesn't blind them the way it blinds others. They're able to see the true nature of things. They're able to see the true nature of their society, and they know what the state of their society is. And they also know that in the end, none of that matters, because what's the only thing that matters? Being faithful to the Lord. That's the only thing that matters. And so through it all, they were faithful. And how many times through the 7 churches of Asia, Jesus referenced people who were faithful and those who were willing to die for their faith, and how that they were constantly encouraged to continue to do that, or to be willing to suffer for the cause of Christ, because they understood what was more important, what had more value, and they were able to see through the, I guess you could see the smoke screen that everyone else was being blinded by. Yes?
This kind of calls to mind for me someone that says, I've sinned so much that, there's no way I can be forgiven. Because I don't know that we can grasp the concept of bottomless, because every pit we know has a bottom somewhere. But in my mind, it's like you're just falling and falling and falling and falling, which means you can't climb out, because you never stop. And the only way that you're going to be able to get out of that is by the obedience and then the faithfulness that you have in God.
Yeah.
And so to think that you're just falling all the time and you can't climb out of the pit is pretty, it's sad.
It is. And, but that's part of the reason why Paul uses himself as an example in 1 Timothy chapter 1. He refers to himself as the chief of sinners. Well, there's no such thing as the most sinningest person. I don't know how you say that. The most sinful person who's ever been. There's no such thing. Okay, one sin is the same as 1,000 sins. It doesn't make any difference. But Paul refers to himself as the chief of sinners because he persecuted the church. He didn't know any better, but he still referred to himself as that. And if he could be redeemed, what's the point that he makes to Timothy? If I can be saved, anybody can. In fact, he says, I was for an example to show that anybody could be saved.
And that's our answer to someone that says, no, I've sinned too much, I have to stay in this darkness.
Yeah.
And here in Revelations, they're giving an example of how deep that darkness can be.
Yeah.
And yet you can be.
Yeah. Well, and that goes to the end of chapter 9, which I know we're not there yet, but the end of chapter 9, it's as if God, and what does Paul tell Timothy? God desires all men to what? To be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. All right? And it's not too late until it is actually finally too late. And so while we have breath, we still have an opportunity to do what's right. And that's part of, I think, what God is sounding forth to all people, because it wasn't just, at this point, it's not just saints that God cares about. Does he care about every soul in the Roman Empire? Sure, Jesus died for them too. And so it's not like he's turned his back completely on all the souls who aren't saved. Even today, does God still care about every soul? Absolutely. That's part of the reason why the end of chapter 9, as we're going to see, is such a sad, kind of a sad epilogue of this whole situation, that people refused to turn. They refused to see the state that they were in when the whole point of this was to help them to see it And because they were so given over to everything they were doing, they didn't want to. They chose not to. All right, anything else through question 3? Question 4. What is the significance of the descriptions of these creatures that are shown, their shape, their crowns, all of that, and not each individual one, but ultimately all together? What are they meant to kind of represent? What are they meant to show?
To me, they're meant to show something you're comfortable with, something that you're not afraid of, that you would accept. But then you get to the tail, and it's not such a, so
Yeah.
it's a contradiction because I can accept it because it's something I'm familiar with.
Right. Something you can relate to.
It's a deception.
Right.
So we need to always make sure that we see the stinger, so to speak, and we don't just take things at face value, like
Right.
whatever it is, abortion's okay.
Well, one of the most dangerous things that Satan can convince us, no matter what the sin is and what the temptation is, it's not that big a deal. It's one of the most dangerous things that we can ever allow Satan to convince us. It's not that big a deal. When it doesn't matter what the sin is or what physical repercussions may come from it, is all sin a big deal?
Yes.
Okay, if only we ever sinned just once in our life, would Jesus still have had to have died for us? Yes. That's how big a deal sin is.
And to me, we have some examples of that, whether it's dressing modestly or watching movies that, cause us to think things we don't need to think, or have words in our head we don't need to have words in our head. I mean, it looks, it's just violent. Well, maybe we shouldn't be watching violent movies. So it is something that if society says it's okay, it creeps into us. And we don't always see this thing.
Yeah, and that's part of what these creatures are meant to represent. Something that appeals to us or appeals to the those of the Roman Empire. Something outward that appeals to us. It's something that we don't really see as being dangerous. But then, like you said, on the tail is that stinger, and that's that part that we don't see until it's too late a lot of times. And ultimately, I mean, you think about David and kind of the snowball effect that David's sin with Bathsheba had, leading to the death of Uriah, leading to Nathan then coming to David, thou art the man. And then just for David, just imagining the sorrow he must have felt when it just hit him, I'm sure like a bulldozer, just realizing what all he had done. And it wasn't just the sin with Bathsheba. It was everything else that went into it to try to hide it. And yet it was just that walk on his porch at night, seeing Bathsheba, that one moment, then led to, and did David's sin with Bathsheba have lifelong impact? Yeah. Not just for David. Okay, a lot of us think about David and the things that he had to deal with after this, and it wasn't just Uriah who then died. There were other individuals who died as well. Huh? The baby died, and I mean, Bathsheba's husband, Bathsheba, David had to comfort her, but there was all of Israel suffered because of what David did, and it just goes to show that you can never know ultimately some of what consequences may come from the sting of sin, but the one consequence that is always the same. What does sin lead to in terms of the spirit? Death. That is what all sin leads to. Sure.
They both could have stayed in the bottomless pit.
Yeah.
But they didn't. They returned to God.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting that sometimes people perceive a contradiction in the fact that David, he's referred to as the man after what? God's own heart. Why do you think that is? When we know, I mean, no, I'm not saying that this was David's only sin, okay? It wasn't. But we know full well, for all time, David's sin is well known with Bathsheba and certainly everything that followed. Why would he be referred to as a man after God's own heart if he sinned in such a spectacularly public way?
He trusted God to defeat Goliath.
Okay.
He praised God. He said, my God can do anything.
Okay.
So obviously he wanted to serve God.
Okay. And to me, the key component or the key quality, the key characteristic of one who is after God's own heart is one who seeks to please God. Now, obviously, David failed in that with Bathsheba, and multiple times after that as well. But his, I guess you could say, his guiding principle of his heart and his mind, his soul, was to do what God wanted him to do. And he had faith in Jehovah, even if it meant having to turn on himself and recognize what he had done and to understand the depth of what he'd gone to. He was willing to do that. And I think that you still have that same characteristic in people who, I have great admiration for people who realize that when they've committed a sin that may have lifelong implications, when they're willing to confront that and deal with that and say, I'm still going to be faithful to the Lord. I'll never forget a buddy of mine and his parents who realized that they had no right to be married, and this was 10, 15 years into their marriage. They'd had 2 boys. Those boys were half grown, and they realized they had no right to be married. The husband was converted long after they'd been married, and some things came out that he hadn't thought about regarding Scripture, and they had to make a choice. And they literally sat down together, they studied, and they said, either we can go to heaven separate, or we can go to hell together. And that's what they had to answer that question. And they made the decision to separate because they wanted to go to heaven. And making those types of decisions, people who are willing to put God first. We talked a couple weeks ago about first things first and putting God first through the filter of seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. That's the type of stuff that we have to do. And it's not easy. It's not happy. And we've talked before about the difference between happiness and joy. And I think in a lot of ways you see that playing out kind of in what's being described here. And in our society, people are constantly pursuing the emotion of happiness. But does any happiness last? No. Happiness is an emotion. It comes, it goes. Sometimes there's a reason, sometimes there's not. But joy is something that remains. Joy speaks to the state of blessedness. God takes care of me. God has blessed me. Joy, it can deal with anything. And it should deal with anything, even states of unhappiness, even states of sorrow and difficulty. Joy remains. And that's one of the great, I guess you could say, characteristics that we gain from God when we understand His Word and understand what joy really is about, that it has nothing to do with being happy. It has everything to do with being content, realizing that God has given me what I need. He takes care of me. He watches over me.
Well, I think even that couple you used as an example, I might have heard the same couple, but they lived far apart from each other.
Yeah.
So the temptation, wasn't there. They still talk to each other, they still do all that, but they're not in a marriage they shouldn't be in. But I'm sure even in the hardest part of that, they had joy because they were pleasing God.
Right.
They weren't happy.
Sure.
They had pain because they had children and they were going to miss each other. But they had joy in the deepest part of their heart because they knew they were pleasing God.
Well, and I think in a lot of ways it's almost antithetical to what our society is based upon, to do something that deliberately causes me to be sorrowful. Being sorrowful or what the lack of joy or our lack of happiness is, to do something that is going to deliberately to make me not happy. That's not what our society is built on. Our society is all about self-happiness and what can make me happy in the moment. And it's not about those things that will last. And to do something that's I know full well is going to be something that is not going to make me happy, but I know is something I have to do anyway. That's contrary to human nature. All right, anything else through that? All right, move on to verse 12 and 13 here. We'll go ahead and start part 2 of chapter 9. I know some of you may not have your notes, but here, Revelation chapter 9, verse 12, one woe is past, and behold, there come 2 woes more hereafter. So here, beginning in verse 13, we have this 6th trumpet being blown. And this 6th trumpet is going to represent this 3rd, I guess you could say, component of the ultimate downfall of not just the Roman Empire, but of any empire that would happen to when you have all these put together, this represents that downfall of a nation. But this is going to be this outward invasion, these outward armies that are going to be testing and ultimately bringing to an end a nation that God is bringing judgment upon. And here in verse 13, the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. All right, so verse 13, you've got this golden altar. Now remember this golden altar, do you remember what we read about that earlier in Revelation? There's two altars. One was the burnt offering altar, under which the souls of the saints were asking God, how much longer will you allow this to continue? But then there was a second altar. And on that was offered incense along with what? Prayers. The prayers of the saints. Okay? Now it's interesting that the four horns are mentioned. That goes back to Exodus chapter 30, and there's references to it later on in the Old Testament as well. But these four horns would seem to represent, of this golden altar, would seem to represent kind of the fullness of those who are crying out to Jehovah. Okay, we say the four corners of the earth represents the whole earth. All right, well, these four horns would seem to represent, especially in consideration with this altar and the prayers of the saints being offered with incense, represents kind of the fullness of what these saints have been asking for. The fullness of what the saints have, in terms of their prayers and their cries to Jehovah and noticing the things that are happening to his people. This then presents the response from Jehovah in verse 14. Now, the voice speaking isn't identified. It doesn't really matter, because notice what there's a commandment being issued in verse 14. So regardless of who is speaking here, it's coming from God. And the voice says to the sixth angel, after the sixth angel had sounded his trumpet, loose the four angels that are bound in the great river Euphrates. Now, this is an interesting statement. So there's four angels mentioned here. It's reminiscent of the four corners of the earth with the four angels that were holding back the winds of destruction until all God's people were sealed on their foreheads. But here it's the angels that are bound, and then the commandment is to loose them. And so we'll talk more about that and the river Euphrates and what that may represent next Sunday. Again, the notes for chapter 9 here for this second half of chapter 9 are on the back table, along with this coming Wednesday night's notes for chapter 3 of Messianic Prophecies. Thank you, everybody.